Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. What if the person you love the most has been hiding a dark secret? What happens when the truth is finally revealed on the most important day of your life? In today's story, we follow Diep and James, a couple whose dream wedding takes a shocking turn. When Officer Ly reveals Diep's past, James is left questioning everything he thought he knew about her. Will their love survive this painful revelation, or is their future together doomed before it even begins? Stay tuned until the end to find out how this drama unfolds. Don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 followers. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's dive in. The sun was gentle, its rays soft and warm, dancing across the flowers that swayed lightly in the breeze. Diep and James walked side by side through the garden, the vibrant colors of blooming flowers surrounding them. It was a peaceful day, a rare moment of tranquility. Diep looked at the sky, the sunlit clouds drifting by, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had always felt a certain heaviness in her chest, a weight she couldn't shake off. Even in this perfect moment, she could sense the shadow of her past lurking just behind her. James, unaware of the storm in her heart, hummed softly, admiring the few fruits that had ripened on the trees. His voice was steady, filled with contentment. "It looks like there are really few ripe fruits. Let's go down there and see if there are any." Diep offered him a small smile, her lips trembling slightly. "These 4 trees are enough," she replied quietly, trying to mask the knot tightening in her stomach. Her eyes flickered to the horizon, the distance between them and the unknown future weighing heavily on her mind. There was a deep silence between them, filled only by the sounds of nature. Diep wished she could stay in this moment forever, where nothing seemed to matter. But her past had always been there, haunting her in the corners of her mind. As they sat down to rest beneath the shade of an old tree, the sun still beating down upon them, Diep couldn't shake the thought, what will happen when the truth comes out? James turned to her, his face glowing with warmth. "What should we do next?" he asked with a smile, but Diep could only manage a quiet sigh in response. The wedding day arrived, and everything was set in motion as the day unfolded with a quiet elegance. The soft hum of music echoed through the air, filling the space with an atmosphere of joy and anticipation. Diep stood before the mirror, the white gown draping elegantly over her, yet her eyes held a distant sadness, a quiet longing that no one else could see. Her fingers gently traced the delicate lace of her dress, lost in her own thoughts. James, as calm as ever, stood by her side, adjusting his tie with a small smile. "You look beautiful," he whispered, his voice full of warmth, his eyes soft with admiration. Diep met his gaze, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that danced behind her eyes, something she couldn't shake off. The guests began to gather, and the air filled with the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the fluttering of elegant dresses. The wedding was a dream, a perfect picture of happiness, yet Diep's heart felt heavy. She'd kept her secret for so long, but today it seemed inevitable that the truth would be revealed. James was unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. He was too wrapped up in the joy of the moment, believing that nothing could go wrong. But just as the ceremony began, there was a shift. The door opened unexpectedly, and in walked Officer Ly. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Diep, and in that instant, everything changed. "James," Ly's voice was calm but firm, I have something important to tell you about Diep." The air seemed to still, the moment hanging in silence. The guests turned their heads, and Diep felt her world tilt. James' heart stopped for a moment as he locked eyes with Ly, then with Diep. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. Ly stepped forward, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. "Diep isn't who you think she is." The room seemed to close in on Diep. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she had feared for so long. The truth was now out in the open, and she had no choice but to face the consequences. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like time had stopped. James stood frozen, unable to process the words he had just heard. He looked from Ly to Diep, confusion and disbelief washing over him. It felt as though the world he had built with Diep was crumbling in an instant. Ly stepped forward, his expression serious yet filled with regret. "Diep has a past, James," Ly said, his voice steady and low. "A past she's been hiding from you. She was involved with a dangerous criminal network. She's been living in constant danger for years, trying to escape it. I was assigned to protect her." James couldn't absorb it. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed in, suddenly seemed like a lie. He turned his gaze to Diep, but her eyes betrayed nothing but fear, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "I didn't want you to know, James," Diep said softly, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to put you in danger because of me." James took a step back, his heart aching. "Why didn't you tell me, Diep? Why didn't you trust me?" His voice cracked, raw with hurt. Diep looked down, tears brimming in her eyes. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid of everything falling apart." The room was quiet, the guests awkwardly glancing at one another. The wedding, once filled with love and excitement, now felt like a distant memory. James turned away, unable to look at Diep any longer. The woman he loved, the life they had planned, now seemed like it was slipping through his fingers. James stumbled back, his mind reeling with the weight of the revelation. He was still processing the words, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His hands were trembling, his heart heavy with confusion. The love he had for Diep, so pure and certain just hours ago, now felt like an illusion. Diep stood in silence, her eyes never leaving him, but the distance between them had grown immeasurable. She wanted to reach out, to explain everything, but she knew that no words could undo what had been said. The truth was out, and James was struggling to comprehend it. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could protect you, but I failed." James closed his eyes, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. His mind was filled with 1,000 questions, 1,000 doubts. How could she have kept this from me? What does this mean for us? His heart was torn between the love he still felt for her and the fear that now clouded everything. "Why didn't you trust me, Diep?" he finally managed to ask, his voice raw. "I thought we were supposed to face everything together." Diep felt the weight of his words, the sting of his disbelief. She had wanted to tell him so many times, but each time the fear of losing him had stopped her. Now she feared it was already too late. James looked away, his mind in turmoil. The future they had planned, the dreams they had shared, suddenly felt uncertain. He needed time to think, time to decide. I need some space," he said, his voice tight. I need to think." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Diep standing there, her heart breaking as the love she had fought so hard for seemed to slip away. Diep stood motionless, watching James walk away, her heart sinking with each step he took. The pain of his words, of his rejection, was almost unbearable. She had always feared this moment, but she had never imagined it would come in such a cold, definitive way. She had hoped that James would understand, that he would see the truth of who she was, not just the mistakes of her past. But now, in this silence, she was forced to face the reality that everything she had worked for was unraveling before her eyes. Her legs felt weak, as though the ground beneath her was no longer solid. She had spent so long trying to protect James, trying to build a life with him, but now it seemed like all of that was for nothing. Her mind replayed the moments when she had hesitated to tell him, when she had pushed down the truth, thinking she was doing what was best for him. But now, as the weight of her secrets bore down on her, she realized how wrong she had been. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. She needed to hold on to whatever strength she had left. But then, as if sensing her turmoil, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Ly, his presence a quiet reassurance in the storm of her emotions. "Diep," he said softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "You don't have to carry this alone." She looked up at him, her heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. "But I already have, Ly. And now it's too late." "James needs time," Ly replied gently. "He'll come around, but you have to give him that space. The truth is painful, but it's also the beginning of something new, if you let it be." Diep nodded slowly, though her heart was still in pieces. She had never imagined that love could feel this fragile and uncertain. But she knew, deep down, that the only thing left to do was wait and hope. That evening, James sat quietly at home, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on him. His thoughts were a whirlwind, and no matter how hard he tried to escape them, the truth about Diep kept replaying in his mind. Standing by the window, he stared out into the darkening sky, the silence in the house almost suffocating. Then the front door creaked open. His mother entered, her presence calm and familiar. She immediately noticed something was wrong. With a gentle voice, she asked, "James, what's bothering you?" He turned to her, his face clouded with confusion. "I don't know, Mom. I thought I knew everything about Diep, but now everything feels different. I don't know who she really is anymore." His mother sighed softly, her eyes filled with both concern and understanding. She walked over to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "James, love isn't always what we expect. It's not about perfection. It's about accepting the flaws, the mistakes, and the past of the person you love. Diep may have hidden things from you, but that doesn't mean she doesn't deserve your love." James frowned. "But how can I trust her now? She kept secrets from me." His mother gently squeezed his shoulders. "Trust is built over time. Love isn't about knowing everything. It's about moving forward despite the unknowns. You have to decide if you're willing to forgive her past or let it stop you." James felt a shift within him. "You're right, Mom," he murmured. "I need to think. I need to figure out if I can move past this." His mother smiled softly. "Take your time, James. Don't let fear make your choices." James spent the following days in solitude. reflecting on everything that had happened. His mother's words lingered in his mind, but the truth about Diep weighed heavily on his heart. He couldn't stop thinking about their moments together, the love they had shared, the way she had looked at him with such trust. It was hard to reconcile that with the woman who had kept such a significant part of her life hidden. The days passed in silence. James couldn't bring himself to see Diep, though he knew deep down that he needed to face her. He was torn, caught between the fear of the unknown and the love he still felt for her. Could he truly accept her past? Could he move forward with her, knowing everything she had been through? Finally, on the evening of the third day, James made up his mind. He needed to see Diep, to have one last conversation, to understand if their love could survive the truth that had come to light. He went to the place where they had first met, a quiet spot by the river that had always felt like their sanctuary. Diep was there, sitting alone, her eyes fixed on the water. When she saw him, her expression was a mixture of hope and fear. She stood up slowly, waiting for him to speak. James took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Diep, I don't know if I can ever truly understand everything you've been through, but I know that I still care for you, and I want to try to move past this, if you're willing to fight for us too." Tears welled up in Diep's eyes as she stepped closer to him. "I'm willing, James. I'll fight for us, always." And in that moment, they both knew that, though the road ahead would be uncertain, they were ready to face it together.
Câu chuyện xoay quanh Diep và James, một cặp đôi chuẩn bị kết hôn. Tuy nhiên, ngay vào ngày trọng đại của mình, cảnh sát Ly tiết lộ quá khứ đầy bí ẩn của Diep, khiến James phải đối mặt với sự thật đau đớn. Diep từng liên quan đến mạng lưới tội phạm nguy hiểm. Cô để giấu kín điều này để bảo vệ James. James bàng hoàng và thất vọng, không biết phải làm gì khi và anh phải đấu tranh giữa tình yêu và sự tin tưởng. Liệu họ có thể vượt qua những thử thách này và tiếp tục xây dựng tương lai bên nhau? Câu chuyện đầy cảm xúc này sẽ khiến bạn không thể rời mắt